There's an audio recording that was played in a Minnesota courtroom in 2014. It lasts 7 seconds. When the jury heard it, 3 people fainted. The man who made that recording was a homeowner defending his property. The teenagers on the tape were burglars breaking into his basement. The first shot he fired was legal. The second was legal. Even the third might have been justified. But somewhere between the third shot and the 7th second of that recording, a homeowner became a murderer. And here's what keeps prosecutors awake at night. If you were in that basement, in that moment of pure adrenaline and terror, would you have known when to stop? Byron Smith prepared for 18 hours before the teenagers broke in. He brought water. He brought snacks. He brought a tape recorder to document his legal self-defense. So why did that recording send him to prison for life? What was on those 7 seconds? We'll return to that basement, but first, you need to understand something about the law that nobody tells you until it's too late. The moment you stop being afraid and start being angry is the moment you become a murderer. And that moment can happen in the time it takes to exhale. Case number 1, Markus Kaarma. Let me show you how a trap is built. Missoula, Montana, April 2014. Markus Kaarma was 29 years old, a contractor, married, living in a quiet residential neighborhood where the biggest crime was usually kids skateboarding past the no skateboarding signs. But in 3 weeks, his detached garage had been broken into twice. They'd stolen his marijuana plants, his wife's purse, about $600 in cash. The police investigation produced nothing. No arrests, no suspects, just a report number Kaarma could give his insurance company. He told his neighbors he felt violated. He told his hairdresser something else. He told her, "I'm going to shoot some fucking kids." That statement would become Exhibit A in his murder trial. Because Markus Kaarma didn't just prepare to defend his home, he engineered a scenario where defense would become necessary. Think about the psychology of this. You've been burglarized twice. You're angry. You're scared. But more than that, you're humiliated. Someone has violated your space, and you couldn't stop them. The police couldn't stop them. You feel powerless. So you take the power back, not by installing better locks, not by getting an alarm system, by creating an opportunity for revenge disguised as defense. Step 1, the bait. Markus left his garage door open, not wide open, just 18 inches, enough that a curious teenager walking by at night could see inside, enough to be tempting. He positioned his wife's purse on a chair in clear view, illuminated by a motion sensor light he'd installed 2 days earlier. Step 2, the surveillance. He installed a Graco baby monitor in the garage, the kind you use to watch infants sleeping. He ran the video feed to a tablet in his bedroom. The angle was perfect. He could see the entire garage space, but couldn't identify faces in the dark. That detail would matter later. Step 3, the weapon. A Remington 870 shotgun loaded with 4 shells. He didn't chamber a round yet, which suggests he had some control. He wasn't so trigger-happy that he'd fire by accident. He was waiting for the right moment. Then he went to bed. His wife, Janelle Flager, later testified that Markus couldn't sleep. He kept checking the tablet. Every car that passed made him tense. He wanted someone to come. He was ready. At 12:30 a.m. on April 27th, the motion sensor triggered. 17-year-old Diren Dede had been in America for 8 months. He was a German exchange student, living with a host family, attending high school, learning English. In 8 months, he'd never been in trouble. He'd never been arrested. But he'd learned one American tradition from local kids: garage hopping. Why did this teenager make the worst decision of his life? Deeren Dede wasn't a hardened criminal. He was a kid doing something stupid that teenagers have done in Montana for decades, checking unlocked garages for beer to steal. It's trespassing, it's theft, it's a misdemeanor. It's not supposed to be a death sentence. When Deeren entered through the partially open garage door, he saw the purse. He reached for it, and Markus Kaarma was watching from his bedroom 30 feet away on a glowing tablet screen. He didn't call 911. He didn't shout a warning. He didn't turn on the lights. He grabbed his shotgun, walked out his back door, approached the garage from the side, and fired 4 blasts through the wooden wall into the dark interior. He couldn't see what he was shooting at. The baby monitor showed a figure moving, but not details, not age, not whether the person was armed, just movement. The first shot hit Deeren in the arm. The second hit him his hip. The third and fourth hit him in his torso. The spread pattern, later analyzed by forensics, showed Kaarma had swept the shotgun in a horizontal arc, covering maximum area. He wasn't aiming at a specific threat. He was ensuring whoever was inside would be hit. All 4 shots were fired in under 3 seconds. When police arrived, they found Deeren Dede dead in the garage, surrounded by stolen items worth approximately $35, a purse, some loose change, a flashlight. Markus told the responding officers he'd feared for his life, but then they started investigating. This is where the trap Markus set for the intruder became the trap that caught him, because the police interviewed his hairdresser, and she testified that 4 days before the shooting, Markus had sat in her chair and said he was going to shoot some fucking kids who'd been breaking into garages in the neighborhood. That statement proved premeditation. Then they pulled his internet search history. In the week before the shooting, Markus had researched Montana's castle doctrine laws. He'd read articles about homeowners who'd been acquitted for shooting intruders. He'd studied what was legal and what wasn't. That proved he was planning. Then they examined the setup itself, the partially open door, the visible purse, the motion sensor light that would alert him the moment someone entered. That proved intent. The prosecutor called it human hunting. She argued that Markus Kaarma hadn't defended his home. He'd baited a trap and waited for prey. The defense argued he'd been legitimately afraid after 2 break-ins and had every right to protect his property. The jury sided with the prosecution. They convicted Markus Kaarma of deliberate homicide. He was sentenced to 70 years in Montana State Prison. At sentencing, the judge said something that still echoes through self-defense law. You had every right to feel unsafe. You had every right to protect your home. But the moment you engineered a scenario where you could shoot someone, you crossed from victim to predator, and the law does not protect predators. Deeren Dede's parents flew from Germany to the trial. His mother testified that her son had been excited to experience American culture, American freedom, American opportunity. She said he'd called her the day before he died and told her Montana was beautiful. She never expected to bury him there. Markus Kaarma is serving 70 years for shooting an intruder in his own garage, but 800 miles south in Oklahoma, a pharmacist shot an intruder in his store and also got life in prison. Except this one is more disturbing, because for 60 seconds, Jerome Ersland was a hero. Then he became a murderer. What happened in those 60 seconds?
Case number 2. Jerome Ersland. Oklahoma City, May 19, 2009, 2:47 p.m. The reliable discount pharmacy sits on a corner in a neighborhood that's seen better days. Bars on the windows, security cameras that may or may not work, The kind of place where the pharmacist knows customers by name and keeps track of who can't afford their medications so he can slip them a few pills for free. Jerome Ersland had been a pharmacist for 14 years, 57 years old, married, father of 3, military veteran, the kind of man who wore reading glasses on a chain and kept photos of his grandchildren on the counter. On surveillance footage from that afternoon, you can see him organizing pill bottles with methodical precision, occasionally helping elderly customers read prescription labels. At 2:48 p.m., 2 figures in ski masks crashed through the front door like a bomb went off. Imagine this from Jerome Ersland's perspective. You're standing behind the counter. You hear the door explode inward. You look up. 2 masked figures. The tall one is holding what looks like a gun, later determined to be a convincing BB gun, but in that split second you can't know that. The short one is screaming threats. They're moving toward you fast. You have 1 second to decide if you're about to die. Your brain doesn't think, it reacts, fight or flight, and if you're armed, flight isn't an option. Jerome Ersland kept a Taurus 9mm pistol under the counter. He'd bought it after the pharmacy was robbed 6 months earlier. He'd never fired it except at a range. But when he saw those masks, his hand moved on instinct. The first shot hit 16-year-old Antoine Parker in the head. The teenager's body folded backward like someone cut his strings. His fake gun, a realistic BB pistol he'd brought to scare the pharmacist, skittered across the linoleum. His accomplice, 14-year-old Jevontai Ingram, saw his friend collapse and did anything any terrified child would do. He screamed, he turned, he ran out the door into the Oklahoma heat and disappeared. On the surveillance footage, you can see Jerome Ersland standing behind the counter. His hands are shaking. The pharmacy is silent except for fluorescent lights humming overhead. Antoine Parker is motionless on the floor, a dark pool spreading beneath his head. The threat is over. This is the moment where Jerome Ersland is a hero. This is the moment where he has done exactly what Oklahoma law allows, defended himself with appropriate force against an immediate lethal threat. This is the moment where he should have called 911. What happened in the next 60 seconds transformed Jerome Ersland from a hero into a convicted murderer serving life in prison. The surveillance camera captured everything. The jury watched it 11 times. By the 3rd viewing, 2 jurors were crying. What did they see? Jerome Ersland doesn't call 911. He stands there for approximately 5 seconds, breathing hard, staring at Antoine Parker's motionless body. Then he does something that still confuses psychologists and prosecutors. He steps over the body. He walks to the back room. He retrieves a second gun, a .380 Smith & Wesson. He returns to the main floor. Antoine Parker is still unconscious, still not moving. The medical examiner would later testify that at this moment, the teenager was alive. The head wound was serious but survivable. With immediate medical attention, Antoine Parker could have lived. Jerome Ersland stands over him and fires 5 shots directly into the 16-year-old's abdomen. The surveillance footage shows it all. The execution lasts 11 seconds, 5 deliberate shots into a motionless target lying on the floor. Then Jerome Ersland returns to the counter, places both guns down, and waits 40 minutes before calling the police. When officers arrived, Jerome told them he'd defended his store from armed robbers. He told them he'd feared for his life. He told them he'd acted in self-defense. And for the first shot, he was absolutely right. But the medical examiner told a different story. Dr. Chai Choi performed the autopsy. He testified that Antoine Parker had been shot 6 times total. The first shot to the head had rendered him immediately unconscious. The 6 subsequent shots to the abdomen were fired at point-blank range. Powder burns on the skin proved the gun had been within inches of the body. Those 5 shots caused massive internal bleeding. Those 5 shots killed him. Dr. Choi's testimony included one detail that destroyed Jerome Ersland's defense. Based on blood spatter analysis and the trajectory of the wounds, Antoine Parker had been lying completely motionless when the final 5 shots were fired. He wasn't moving, he wasn't threatening, he was unconscious and dying, and Jerome Ersland shot him anyway. This is where the law becomes simultaneously crystal clear and deeply disturbing. The first shot, legal self-defense. A masked armed robber charging at you? Fire away. The law protects you. The 6th shot, first-degree murder. An unconscious teenager on your floor? That's execution. But what about the 60 seconds in between? What was happening in Jerome's mind as he walked to the back room, retrieved a second gun, and returned to fire 5 more times? The defense attorneys argued adrenaline. They brought in experts who testified about the physiological effects of a life-threatening encounter, how adrenaline floods your system, how your perception of time distorts, how you can make decisions that seem rational in the moment but are actually the result of a brain in chemical chaos. They argued that Jerome Ersland was still in survival mode, that he genuinely believed Antoine Parker was still a threat, that the 60 seconds felt like 6 to a man whose heart was beating 180 times per minute. The prosecution played the surveillance footage again and again. They made the jury watch Jerome Ersland step over the body, walk calmly to the back room, retrieve a second gun, stand over a motionless 16-year-old, and fire 5 times. The prosecutor said, "If he'd fired those 5 shots immediately after the first, I might believe fear. If he'd fired them while the accomplice was still in the store, I might believe survival instinct. But he took a break. He walked away. He made a conscious decision to retrieve another weapon, and then he executed a child." The jury deliberated for 8 hours. They convicted Jerome Ersland of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without possibility of parole. At sentencing, Antoine Parker's mother testified. She said her son had made a terrible mistake, that he'd fallen in with the wrong crowd, that he'd been trying to get money for drugs, but she said he was still her baby. He was 16 years old, and Jerome Ersland had shot him in the stomach 5 times while he lay unconscious and bleeding. She looked directly at Ersland and said, "You didn't kill a robber. You killed a child, and you did it because you wanted to." Jerome Ersland maintained his innocence. He appealed the verdict, arguing that Oklahoma's self-defense laws should have protected him. The appeals court disagreed, ruling, "Self-defense ends when the threat ends. The moment the perpetrator is no longer capable of harming you, any further use of force is retribution, not defense. And retribution is not a legal justification for killing." Jerome Ersland went to prison because he fired 6 shots instead of 1. But what if you fire 1 shot and it hits someone in the back while they're running? In England, that's exactly what happened to a farmer who'd been burglarized so many times the police stopped responding. His name was Tony Martin, and his case divided an entire nation.
Case number 3, Tony Martin. Norfolk, England, August 20th, 1999, 12:30 a.m. The house was called Bleak House, and the name wasn't metaphorical. It was a crumbling Victorian farmhouse isolated in the countryside, miles from the nearest neighbor, accessible only by a rutted dirt road that turned to mud in winter. No phone, electricity only in half the rooms. Tony Martin, 54 years old, lived there alone like a man from another century, surrounded by antiques and paranoia. He'd been burglarized at least 6 times in the previous 2 years. Sometimes they took valuable antiques, sometimes just cash. Once they'd taken food from his kitchen and ransacked his bedroom while he slept. The British police investigated each time, but in rural Norfolk with limited resources, burglary investigations went nowhere unless there was significant violence or caught-in-the-act arrests. Tony Martin told anyone who would listen that he felt like prey in his own home. He applied twice for a firearms certificate so he could legally own a gun for protection. Both times, police denied the application due to concerns about his mental stability. He'd been diagnosed with paranoid personality disorder. So he got a gun anyway, an illegal pump-action shotgun. In the UK, pump-action shotguns are classified as prohibited weapons. Possessing one carries a mandatory 5-year sentence even without using it. Tony Martin knew this. He kept it anyway. He kept it loaded, and he waited. Imagine living in that isolation. Every sound at night is a potential threat. Every creak is footsteps. Every gust of wind rattling a window sounds like someone prying it open. You've called the police 6 times and watched them take reports that led to nothing. You're alone, you're afraid, and you're armed with a weapon that could send you to prison just for owning it. You're not defending your home anymore. You're waiting for war. On the night of August 20th, 1999, 2 men broke into Bleak House through a ground-floor window. Brendan Fearon, 29 years old, career criminal with multiple burglary convictions. Fred Barris, 16 years old, already with a criminal record dating back to age 13. They were looking for antiques to sell. They thought the house was empty, no lights, no sounds, no car outside. Tony Martin was waiting at the top of the stairs in complete darkness. When Fearon and Barris reached the staircase, they heard nothing, no shouting, no warning, just 3 gunshots in rapid succession. The first shot missed entirely. The second hit Brendan Fearon in the leg, a painful but non-fatal wound. The third hit Fred Barris in the back as the teenager turned to run. 16-year-old Fred Barris made it to a window. He tried to climb out, but the wound was too severe. He collapsed half out the window, bleeding. He managed to crawl into the garden before he died near the property line. Brendan Fearon, wounded and terrified, dragged himself out of the house. He collapsed in the driveway. He later testified that he could hear Fred screaming for help in the darkness, and then silence. Tony Martin didn't call for help. He didn't call police. He didn't call an ambulance. He went back to bed and waited until morning. Then he called a friend who told him to turn himself in immediately. When police arrived, they found Fred Barris's body in the garden. They found Brendan Fearon suffering from a severe leg wound in the driveway. And they found Tony Martin calmly waiting for them with the illegal shotgun on his kitchen table. He told them they got what they deserved. Tony Martin's trial became one of the most controversial cases in British legal history. Half the country thought he was a hero, the other half thought he was a murderer. The verdict would depend on one question: can you shoot someone in the back while they're escaping? The trial lasted 3 weeks. The courtroom was packed every day with protesters from both sides. Farmers from across England organized convoys to London to demonstrate outside the courthouse. They carried signs reading, "A man's home is his castle," and "Justice for Tony Martin." The defense argued that Tony Martin had been terrorized in his own home for years, that the justice system had failed him, that he'd snapped under the psychological pressure of repeated violations. They presented evidence of the 6 previous burglaries. They presented psychiatric evaluations showing paranoid personality disorder. They argued he genuinely feared for his life. The prosecution argued that shooting someone in the back while they're fleeing is execution, not defense. They presented ballistics evidence proving all 3 shots had been fired from the top of the stairs, meaning Tony Martin had a tactical advantage, a clear line of retreat, and could have locked himself in an upstairs room instead of engaging. Most damning, they presented evidence that Tony Martin had positioned himself at the top of the stairs specifically to ambush anyone who entered. He hadn't been surprised in his bedroom. He'd been waiting in the dark with an illegal weapon, ready to kill. The jury deliberated for 2 days. They convicted him of murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. The verdict sparked national outrage. Over 25,000 people signed petitions demanding his release. Opinion polls showed 48% of British citizens believed Tony Martin should never have been prosecuted. The farmers who demonstrated during the trial vowed to continue protesting until he was freed. The argument was everywhere. If the police won't protect you, don't you have the right to protect yourself? The counter-argument was equally passionate. If we allow people to shoot fleeing criminals in the back, we don't have a justice system. We have vigilante warfare. Both arguments are correct. That's what makes this case so disturbing. Tony Martin had been burglarized repeatedly. The police had failed to protect him. He was living in genuine fear. And when 2 criminals broke into his home in the middle of the night, he had every reason to believe his life was in danger. But he shot a 16-year-old teenager in the back while the kid was trying to escape. That's not defense. That's execution. And yet, what was Tony Martin supposed to do? Call police who'd already failed him 6 times? Wait for burglars to escalate to violence? Live in constant terror until someone decided to hurt him instead of just robbing him? On appeal, Tony Martin's murder conviction was reduced to manslaughter. The Court of Appeals ruled that his paranoid personality disorder had diminished his responsibility. He genuinely couldn't assess threat levels the way a reasonable person would. He was released in 2003 after serving 3 years. Brendan Fearon, the surviving burglar, attempted to sue Tony Martin for damages, claiming the shooting had left him with a permanent disability. The lawsuit would spark renewed outrage, but it was eventually dismissed by the courts. Tony Martin gave several interviews after his release. In one, he said, "I didn't want to kill anyone. I wanted them to leave me alone. But when you live in fear every day, when the law won't protect you, what choice do you have?" In another interview, when asked if he'd do it again, he paused. Then he said, "I'd do anything to have that night back. Not because I regret defending myself, but because a 16-year-old is dead, and I have to live with that." Fred Barris's mother gave only one interview. She said, "My son was a thief. I won't pretend he wasn't, but he was 16 years old, and he was running away when he got shot in the back. You don't kill someone for stealing. You just don't." Tony Martin served 3 years for killing a fleeing teenager. But in Minnesota, Byron Smith got life in prison for almost the exact same thing. What's the difference? Why do some people walk free while others die in prison? The answer is on a tape recorder, and it's the most disturbing 7 seconds you'll never hear.
Case number 4. Byron Smith. Little Falls, Minnesota. Population 8,000. The kind of town where people still leave their doors unlocked, where the high school football team makes front-page news, where the biggest controversy is usually about property taxes or snow removal. Until Thanksgiving Day, 2012. Byron Smith was 64 years old, retired from the State Department after a career analyzing international security threats. Intelligent, methodical, living alone in a large house on Elm Street in a neighborhood where nothing ever happened. Until it did. Starting in October 2012, Byron's home was burglarized 3 times in 6 weeks. The first time, they took cash from a drawer. The second time, they took his mother's jewelry, irreplaceable items that had survived 3 generations, including a ring his mother had worn since 1945. The third time, they took firearms from his collection, including guns that had belonged to his father. Byron called police after each break-in. Officers took reports, filed them, investigated when they had time. But Little Falls is a small town with limited resources. No arrests were made. Byron told his neighbor, Bill Anderson, that he felt like a victim in his own home. He told another neighbor he was not going to let them keep violating me. He told a third neighbor something more disturbing. If they come back, I'm going to be ready. So he prepared, methodically, carefully, like a man who'd spent his career analyzing threats and planning responses. On Thanksgiving Day, November 22, 2012, Byron Smith didn't cook dinner. He didn't visit family. He moved furniture in his basement to create an unobstructed line of sight from the bottom of the stairs to the door. He brought down his Mini 14 rifle. He brought his .22 revolver. He brought extra ammunition. He brought water. He brought energy bars in case he had to wait a long time. He brought a tarp, which he later claimed was for covering broken glass. Prosecutors would argue it was for covering bodies. And he brought a tape recorder. This detail haunts me more than anything else in this entire story. Byron Smith brought a tape recorder to document what he believed would be a legal act of self-defense. He wanted evidence. He wanted audio proof that he'd warned the intruders, that he'd feared for his life, that everything he did was justified. But instead, that tape recorder captured the exact moment a homeowner became a murderer and sent him to prison for the rest of his life. Byron testified later that he brought the recorder to capture any threats the intruders might make against him, to have evidence for court, to prove self-defense. Prosecutors argued no innocent person records their own self-defense. They argued Byron was creating a trophy, a souvenir of what he was planning to do. At 12:33 p.m., Byron Smith sat in his basement in complete darkness. His phone was turned off. His car was parked 2 blocks away at a neighbor's house to make his home appear empty. He deliberately left the ground floor door unlocked, not wide open, just unlocked so it would open easily if someone tried it. The bait was set. 17-year-old Nicholas Brady had been burglarizing homes for 6 months. He was high on prescription pills he'd stolen from a house earlier that day. He needed money for drugs. He knew Byron Smith's house had been easy to break into before. He was about to make his last mistake of his life. Nicholas entered through the unlocked door at 12:33 p.m. He walked through the main floor, rifling through drawers, looking for cash or jewelry or pills. Then he found the basement door. He opened it. He started down the stairs. Byron Smith was waiting in darkness, 10 feet away, his rifle raised, his finger on the trigger, his tape recorder running. The first shot hit Nicholas in the chest. The teenager tumbled down the remaining stairs and landed on the concrete floor with a sound the tape captured like a sack of meat hitting pavement. Byron Smith walked over to him, and the recorder captured something that still makes prosecutors' skin crawl. Byron laughed, a short, clipped, satisfied sound. Then he said, calm as someone commenting on the weather, "You're dead." But Nicholas Brady wasn't dead. He was making sounds. The medical examiner later described them as agonal breathing, the body's last automatic attempt to survive, gurgling, gasping, the sound of a teenager dying on a basement floor. Byron Smith fired another shot under Nicholas's chin, angled upward into the brain. Now Nicholas Brady was dead. Byron dragged the body into a back corner of the basement. The tape recorded the sound of fabric scraping across concrete, heavy breathing, and Byron talking to himself in that same calm voice. "I'm not a bleeding heart liberal. I felt like I was cleaning up a mess." Then he sat down and waited.
But this isn't the 7 seconds that convicted him, because upstairs, someone else had just noticed Nicholas hadn't returned to the car, someone who was about to walk into the same trap. 18-year-old Hale Kiffer had been friends with Nicholas Brady since middle school. They'd started breaking into homes together 6 months earlier, first for thrill, then for drug money, then because it was the only thing they knew how to do anymore. She was sitting in the car outside, watching the street, waiting for Nicholas to finish. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Nicholas should have been out by now. Hale made the worst decision of her young life. She went in after him. Hale Kiffer entered the house at 12:47 p.m., 14 minutes after Nicholas Brady. She called his name softly as she moved through the main floor. No answer. She saw the basement door open. She called down the stairs. No answer. She started descending. Byron Smith was waiting in the exact same position, same darkness, same rifle, same finger on the trigger. The tape recorder captured everything. The shot hit Hale as she reached the bottom step. She fell forward, landing hard. The recorder captured her voice, surprised and confused. Oh, just that, one syllable, the sound of an 18-year-old girl realizing she'd been shot. Byron Smith approached her. The recorder captured his breathing, not panicked, not rapid, but calm and controlled, the breathing of someone in complete control of their actions. Hale Kiffer was still alive, still conscious. She looked up at him. What happened next lasted 7 seconds. The recording was played in court only once. The judge warned the jury beforehand. Some looked away. 3 fainted. When it finished, the courtroom was silent for 30 seconds before anyone could speak. What did they hear? Byron Smith put down his rifle. He picked up his .22 revolver. He placed the barrel under Hale Kiffer's chin, and he whispered, "You're dying." Then he fired. The recording captured the gunshot, the sound of Hale's body going limp, and then something worse. Byron dragging Hale across the concrete floor onto the tarp he'd prepared hours earlier, the scraping sound, the wet sounds, and Byron talking to himself in that same calm voice. I felt like I was cleaning up a mess. He left both bodies in his basement on the tarp. He didn't call police. He went upstairs, ate his Thanksgiving dinner alone, and slept in his own bed with 2 dead teenagers 14 feet below him. He waited until 10 a.m. the next morning, 21 hours after the shootings, before calling his neighbor Bill Anderson and asking if he knew a good lawyer. When police arrived and searched the basement, they found Nicholas Brady and Hale Kiffer's bodies side by side on the tarp. They found the rifle, the revolver, the spent shell casings, and they found the tape recorder. I want you to understand something about this recording that the media reports don't fully convey. It wasn't just 7 seconds of horror. The full recording was 17 minutes long. It documented both shootings, the execution shots, Byron dragging the bodies, and his commentary afterwards. But those 7 seconds, from "you're dying" to the final shot, those were the moments that destroyed any possibility of a self-defense claim, because they revealed something beyond fear, beyond survival instinct. They revealed satisfaction. Byron's trial began in April 2014. The courtroom was packed every day with media, curious onlookers, and the families of Nicholas Brady and Hale Kiffer. The defense argued that Byron had been terrorized by repeated burglaries, that police hadn't protected him, that he genuinely feared for his life when the teenagers broke in. They presented evidence of the 3 previous burglaries. They showed photos of his mother's jewelry. They argued Byron was a victim who'd finally defended himself after the justice system failed him. The prosecution played the tape, all 17 minutes. The jury sat in complete silence, listening to Byron Smith execute two teenagers, listening to him laugh, listening to him whisper, "You're dying," before firing the kill shot, listening to him drag bodies like he was taking out trash. When the recording ended,
The prosecutor didn't say anything. She just looked at the jury and sat down. The defense tried to explain it. They brought in experts on adrenaline and trauma responses. They argued Byron had been in shock, that his comments were the result of psychological dissociation, that he didn't mean what he said the way it sounded. But the prosecutor had the tape, and the tape didn't lie. She said in her closing argument, the first shot, that was self-defense, maybe even the second shot. But when he whispered, "You're dying," to an 18-year-old girl and then shot her under the chin while she lay wounded on his basement floor, that's not self-defense. That's murder. That's execution. And it revealed that somewhere in Byron Smith's preparation, his waiting, his recording, he wanted this to happen. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. They convicted Byron Smith of 2 counts of first-degree premeditated murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without possibility of parole. At sentencing, the families testified. Nicholas Brady's mother said her son had made terrible choices, but he was 17 years old. He deserved rehab, not a bullet. Hale Kiffer's father said his daughter had struggled with addiction, that she'd been trying to get clean, that she'd called him 2 days before her death and promised she was going to change. Both families looked at Byron Smith and asked the same question: why didn't you just call the police? Why did you have to kill them? Byron Smith never answered. He maintained to the end that he'd acted in legal self-defense, that the jury had been biased by inflammatory audio, that he was the real victim. The 7 seconds that convicted Byron Smith weren't just about what he did, they were about what they revealed. A homeowner defending himself doesn't whisper, "You're dying," before executing a wounded teenager. A victim doesn't laugh after shooting someone. A person in fear doesn't drag bodies onto a pre-positioned tarp while commenting about cleaning up a mess. Those 7 seconds revealed that Byron Smith had crossed a line, and he'd crossed it long before Nicholas Brady walked down those basement stairs. Byron Smith is spending the rest of his life in prison. But 900 miles south in Texas, a man named Joe Horn shot 2 burglars and walked free. He didn't wait in the dark. He didn't record anything, but he did ignore 911 dispatchers 14 times. So why is he home eating dinner while Byron Smith dies behind bars? Case number 5, Joe Horn. Pasadena, Texas, November 14, 2007, 2:13 p.m. Joe Horn was 61 years old, retired, living in a quiet suburban neighborhood where the streets had names like Timberline and Pine Hollow, and the biggest excitement was usually which house had the best Christmas lights. He was eating lunch in his living room, watching TV, when he looked out his window and saw 2 men breaking into his neighbor's house. He didn't know his neighbor well. They'd exchanged waves, maybe had one conversation about lawn maintenance, but he knew a burglary when he saw one. He called 911. The call lasted 7.5 minutes. Every word was recorded, and it would become one of the most analyzed, debated, and controversial pieces of audio evidence in American self-defense law. The 911 dispatcher told Joe Horn one thing. She repeated it 14 times. He ignored her. 2 men died in his front yard, and a grand jury refused to indict him. Why? Let me play you this conversation the way it happened, because the specific words matter. Joe Horn: "I've got a shotgun. Do you want me to stop them?" Dispatcher: "No, do not go outside the house. Stay inside."
Horn, but they're getting away with it. They're robbing my neighbor's house right now. Dispatcher, I understand, sir, but I have officers on the way. I don't want you to go outside. It's not worth risking your life. Horn, well, here it is. I'm going outside. Dispatcher, no, sir, do not go outside. I can't let them get away with this. On the recording, you can hear the dispatcher's voice changing, getting more urgent, more desperate. She's not just advising anymore, she's begging. Dispatcher, sir, I'm begging you, please do not go outside that house. The police are 2 minutes away. 2 minutes. Please wait inside where it's safe. Horn, I'm not gonna let them get away. I'm sorry, but I'm not. Dispatcher, you're going to get yourself killed, or you're going to kill someone. Please, stay inside. There's a pause on the recording. The dispatcher thinks maybe she's gotten through to him. Then you hear a door open. Horn, they're coming out now. They're in my yard. I'm going out there. Dispatcher, no, sir, do not. Horn, they're running. I'm not letting them get away. What happened next was captured on audio, but not video. No surveillance cameras, no witnesses except Joe Horn himself and the 911 dispatcher listening helplessly on the phone. According to Joe Horn's account, the two men, later identified as Miguel Antonio de Jesus, 38, and Diego Ortiz, 30, both undocumented immigrants from Colombia, came out of his neighbor's house with a pillowcase full of stolen items. They saw Horn on his porch with a shotgun. They turned toward him. Horn felt threatened. He fired. 2 shots, 2 bodies. Miguel Antonio de Jesus died instantly from a blast to the chest. Diego Ortiz died from a shot that hit him in the side and back as he turned to run. On the audio recording, you can hear it all. The 2 gunshots, the dispatcher screaming, "Sir, what have you done?" Horn breathing hard, saying, "I had to. They were coming at me." Police arrived 90 seconds later. Horn was still on the porch, still holding the shotgun. The dispatcher still on the phone, begging him to put the weapon down before officers arrived. The 2 bodies were in Horn's front yard. Neither man was armed. The bag they were carrying contained jewelry and electronics from the neighbor's house, worth approximately $2,000. This is the moment where America split into 2 camps. Camp 1 said, "Horn is a hero. He stopped criminals. He protected his neighborhood. He did what police couldn't do because they weren't there fast enough. He's the kind of neighbor everyone wants, someone who doesn't just hide and watch while your house gets robbed." Camp 2 said, "Horn is a vigilante. He executed 2 unarmed men over property that wasn't even his. He ignored 14 explicit warnings from emergency services. He created a deadly confrontation that didn't need to happen. If he'd waited 90 seconds, police would have arrested the burglars and nobody would have died." Here's where Texas law changes everything. In most states, Joe Horn would have been arrested immediately and charged at minimum manslaughter, possibly murder. He left the safety of his home. He ignored direct orders from 911. He confronted unarmed men who were leaving a crime scene. He shot one in the back. But Texas Penal Code Section 9.42 is different. It allows the use of deadly force to prevent someone from fleeing with stolen property if there's no other way to recover that property. It's one of the broadest property protection laws in America. The case went to a grand jury. For 3 days, prosecutors presented evidence. They played the 911 recording in its entirety. They emphasized the 14 warnings. They showed autopsy reports proving Diego Ortiz had been shot in the back while fleeing. They brought in the dispatcher who'd begged Horn to stay inside. The grand jury declined to indict him. They ruled that under Texas law, Joe Horn had acted within his legal rights. The decision sparked national outrage and celebration in equal measure. Protesters demonstrated outside the courthouse. Gun rights advocates held rallies supporting Horn. Immigrant rights groups held vigils for the 2 men who died. The prosecutor who presented the case later gave an interview. He said something that still resonates. The law in Texas is clear, but clarity isn't the same as justice. Joe Horn had the legal right to do what he did. Whether he had the moral right, that's a question every person has to answer for themselves. Miguel Antonio de Jesus and Diego Ortiz's families filed wrongful death lawsuits. The cases were settled out of court for undisclosed amounts, rumored to be in the low six figures. Joe Horn gave one press conference. He said he regretted that 2 people died, but he'd do it again if faced with the same situation. He said his neighborhood was safer because criminals now knew people would fight back. Then he disappeared from public life, moved away, changed his phone number. Joe Horn walked free because of where he lived. Byron Smith died in prison because of what he said. But in California, an 80-year-old man shot a fleeing burglar in the back and also walked free. What's different about Thomas Greer? And why does being old, injured, and frail mean you can get away with what others go to prison for?
Case number 6, Thomas Greer, Long Beach, California, July 22, 2014, 11:45 p.m. Everyone who knew Thomas Greer described him the same way: frail, soft-spoken, kind, the type of elderly gentleman who moved slowly, who needed reading glasses for everything, who you'd help carry groceries without being asked. At 80 years old, he lived alone in a modest house in a neighborhood that had been slowly declining for years. He'd been burglarized once before, 6 months earlier. They'd taken his television, some cash, and most painfully, his late wife's wedding ring, the one piece of her he had left. On the night of July 22nd, they came back. Andrea Miller, 28 years old, and her boyfriend, Gus Adams, 26 years old. They'd been watching Thomas Greer's house for 3 days, learning his routine. They knew he was old. They knew he lived alone. They thought he'd be easy. They were wrong. Imagine being 80 years old, asleep in your bed when you hear glass breaking. Your heart is already fragile. A pacemaker keeps it beating regularly. Your bones are brittle. You fractured a rib just coughing last month. You're alone. You're vulnerable. And someone is in your house. They entered through a back window at 11:45 p.m. The sound of breaking glass woke Thomas immediately. He got out of bed, moving as fast as an 80-year-old body allows, and walked into his hallway. Andrea Miller was standing there with a flashlight. What happened next depends entirely on whose account you believe, and the only surviving witnesses were Thomas Greer and Gus Adams. Andrea Miller can't testify because she's dead. According to Thomas Greer, Andrea attacked him immediately. She shoved him against the wall, screaming at him to tell him where he kept his safe. Gus Adams grabbed him from behind, holding his arms while Andrea punched him in the face and chest. They beat him. They fractured his collarbone. They broke 2 ribs. He was bleeding. He thought he was going to die. According to Gus Adams, they never touched him. They saw the old man appear in the hallway and immediately decided to leave. Andrea was backing away with her hands up, saying, "We're sorry, we're leaving," when Greer retrieved a gun and started shooting. The surveillance footage from the neighbor's house doesn't show the interior, only the alley afterwards. So the truth of what happened inside that hallway died with Andrea Miller. What we know for certain is this: at some point during the confrontation, Thomas Greer broke free. He went to his bedroom. He retrieved a .22 caliber revolver from his nightstand. When he returned to the hallway, Andrea Miller and Gus Adams were fleeing toward the back door. This is the legal moment where the threat ends. They were running away. The confrontation was over. Thomas was safe in his home with his weapon. The law in every state says this is when you lock your door, catch your breath, and call 911.
Thomas Greer followed them into the alley. Surveillance footage from the neighbor's camera shows him moving with surprising speed for an 80-year-old man with a broken collarbone and fractured ribs. He raised the revolver. Andrea Miller and Gus Adams were running. Andrea looked back. She saw the gun. She screamed, "I'm pregnant! Please don't shoot! I'm pregnant!" She wasn't pregnant. The autopsy would prove it conclusively. But in that moment, in the dark alley, she begged for her life, using the one plea she thought might stop an old man from pulling the trigger. Thomas Greer fired twice. One shot missed, the other hit Andrea Miller in the back, between her shoulder blades. She collapsed face first onto the pavement. Gus Adams kept running and escaped. Thomas returned to his house and called 911. When paramedics arrived 7 minutes later, Andrea Miller was still alive. She died en route to the hospital from massive internal bleeding. Thomas Greer did almost exactly what Byron Smith did. He shot someone who was no longer a threat. He shot them in the back while they were fleeing. He shot them outside his home after the danger had passed. So why did Byron Smith get life in prison while Thomas Greer walked free? The Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office reviewed the case for 6 weeks. They interviewed witnesses. They examined the surveillance footage. They brought in use of force experts. They consulted with prosecutors from other jurisdictions who'd handled similar cases. And then they announced they would not be filing charges. The official statement read, "Given Mr. Greer's age, his serious injuries sustained during the attack, and the totality of circumstances surrounding the confrontation, the people cannot prove beyond a reasonable doubt that his actions were not motivated by reasonable fear for his life." Let me translate that from legal language into plain English. We think he probably broke the law, but we can't prove it to a jury, because they'll look at an 80-year-old bleeding man with a broken collarbone and they'll acquit him. The decision sparked immediate controversy. Andrea Miller's family hired attorneys and filed a wrongful death lawsuit. They argued that Greer had executed a fleeing, unarmed woman in an alley, that he'd shot her in the back, that no amount of prior fear justified killing someone who was running away. The lawsuit was dismissed. The judge ruled that Miller had created the dangerous situation through her own criminal actions, and that Greer's response, while arguably excessive, was understandable given his age and condition. This is where the law stops being about right and wrong and starts being about something much more complicated: sympathy. Byron Smith was 64 years old, healthy and methodical. When a jury looked at him, they saw someone capable of making rational decisions, someone who should have known better. Thomas Greer was 80 years old, frail and bleeding from a beating. When a jury would have looked at him, they'd have seen their grandfather, someone who acted out of terror, not calculation. Both men shot people in the back while they were fleeing, but juries don't just evaluate actions, they evaluate people. The district attorney who declined to prosecute gave one interview afterwards. He said, "Look at the video footage. He's an 80-year-old man who can barely walk. He's bleeding. He's injured. He's just been beaten in his own home by 2 people younger than he could be his grandchildren. Yes, he followed them. Yes, he shot her in the back. But can I prove to 12 jurors that this elderly victim, traumatized and in pain, was thinking clearly enough to know the threat had ended? No, I can't." He added, "If Thomas Greer were 35 years old and healthy, I'd prosecute him for murder. But he's not, and that matters." Thomas Greer gave one interview to a local news station. He said he didn't regret shooting Andrea Miller. He said if she hadn't wanted to die, she shouldn't have broken into an old man's house and beaten him. He showed the camera his injuries, the bruised face, the bandaged collarbone, the medical reports. Then he said something that still echoes. "I'm 80 years old. I don't know how many years I have left, but I'll be damned if I spend them being afraid in my own home." He sold his house 3 months later and moved to an undisclosed location. Neighbors said he was terrified that Gus Adams or Andrea Miller's family would come back for revenge. So the law protects you if you're old and injured. It protects you if you live in Texas. But what if you're young and healthy and you chase an intruder down the street and choke him to death? In Australia, that's exactly what happened to Benjamin Batterham. And unlike everyone else we've discussed, he was found not guilty.
Case 7. Benjamin Batterman. Newcastle, Australia, March 26, 2016, 3:15 a.m. Benjamin Batterman was 33 years old, a chef, married, living in a modest house in a working-class neighborhood. His 18-month-old daughter slept in the bedroom next to his. He was a protective father, the kind who installed extra locks on the doors, who checked the windows before bed, who kept a cricket bat by the nightstand just in case. At 3:15 a.m., a sound woke him. Not breaking glass, not a door being kicked in, just movement. The creak of a floorboard, the sound of someone breathing who shouldn't be there. Benjamin got out of bed as quietly as possible. He didn't turn on lights. He grabbed the cricket bat. He moved through his hallway, his heart hammering, thinking about his daughter sleeping 20 feet away. A man was standing in his daughter's doorway. Imagine that. You wake up, there's a stranger in your house, and he's standing in your baby's doorway. Not in your living room looking for your TV, not in your kitchen looking for your wallet, in your baby's doorway. Every protective instinct in your body ignites like gasoline meeting flame. The intruder was Ricky Slater, 34 years old, career criminal with 36 prior convictions spanning 2 decades, burglary, assault, theft. He'd been released from prison 3 months earlier. He was high on methamphetamine and looking for things to steal to buy more. When Ricky Slater saw Benjamin Batterman, he ran. Out of the daughter's room, through the hallway, out the front door into the street. And Benjamin Batterman, instead of locking his door and calling police, chased him. Down the sidewalk, into the street, 3 houses away, he tackled Slater. They fought. Neighbors heard the commotion and started calling 000, Australia's 911, and Benjamin Batterman put Ricky Slater in a chokehold. The chokehold lasted several minutes. Neighbors testified they heard Slater saying, "I can't breathe." Police arrived to find Benjamin Batterman still holding Slater's unconscious body. Slater died at the hospital 3 hours later. Batterman was charged with murder, but the jury acquitted him. Why? Ricky Slater died from what the medical examiner called asphyxiation in the context of methamphetamine toxicity and pre-existing heart disease. Translation: the chokehold restricted his breathing, the meth made his heart race, and his damaged heart gave out. Benjamin Batterman was arrested at the scene and charged with murder. The trial lasted 3 weeks and became a national sensation in Australia. It reopened the same debates that Joe Horn's case sparked in America. When does defense become murder? When does a citizen's arrest become execution? Where is the line? The prosecution argued that Batterman used excessive force. They presented testimony from neighbors who heard Slater saying, "I can't breathe," while Batterman maintained the chokehold. They argued that once Batterman had subdued Slater, once police were on the way, he should have released him. Continuing the chokehold after someone loses consciousness is assault. If that person dies, it's murder. The defense presented a different narrative.
They argued that Benjamin Batterman wasn't just defending property, he was protecting his baby daughter from a violent criminal who'd been standing in her doorway. They presented Slater's criminal history, 36 convictions, multiple violent assaults, methamphetamine addiction. They argued that Batterman had every reason to believe Slater would return if he let him go. They brought in medical experts who testified that Slater's death wasn't caused solely by the chokehold. The meth toxicity was a major factor. The pre-existing heart condition was a major factor. Yes, the chokehold contributed, but could they prove beyond reasonable doubt that a healthy person would have died from the same chokehold? No. Most importantly, they argued citizen's arrest. Under Australian law, a citizen can use reasonable force to detain someone who's committed a crime until police arrive. The question was whether holding someone in a chokehold for several minutes constitutes reasonable force. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. They acquitted Benjamin Batterman on all charges. They ruled he'd acted in lawful self-defense and citizen's arrest. This is the case that breaks the pattern, because if you've been following the logic of every other story, Benjamin Batterman should be in prison. He chased the intruder outside his home, just like Thomas Greer. He used potentially lethal force after the immediate threat ended, just like Byron Smith. The intruder died from his actions, just like all of them, but he walked free. Why? The answer appears to be a combination of factors. He was protecting his baby daughter. The intruder had 36 prior convictions. The medical evidence was ambiguous enough to create reasonable doubt. And perhaps most importantly, the Australian jury believed Benjamin Batterman's terror was genuine and proportional. After the verdict, Benjamin Batterman gave one interview. He was crying. He said, "I didn't want anyone to die. I just wanted him away from my daughter. I held on because I was terrified he'd come back. I didn't know he was dying. I just knew I couldn't let go." He added, "I have to live with this forever. Every time I close my eyes, I see him. I know his family is devastated. I'm devastated. But if I had to do it again, if there was a man standing in my daughter's doorway, I'd do exactly the same thing." Ricky Slater's family called the verdict a license to kill. They argued that Slater was a human being who deserved justice, that his criminal history didn't mean his life was worthless, that Benjamin Batterman had acted as judge, jury, and executioner. The verdict sparked protests in Sydney and Melbourne. Advocates for criminal justice reform argued that society had decided some lives matter less than others, that if you have a criminal record and drug addiction, you can be killed with impunity. But in Newcastle, in Benjamin Batterman's neighborhood, residents held a different view. They said he was a hero. They said he'd done what any parent would do. They said if the justice system had kept Ricky Slater in prison where he belonged, none of this would have happened. Both groups are right. Both groups are wrong. That's what makes this case so disturbing. Benjamin Batterman killed an intruder and walked free. But we haven't talked about the cases where the homeowners didn't just defend against intruders. They eliminated them with overwhelming force before they could even react. 3 masked teenage boys broke into a house in Oklahoma thinking it was empty. It wasn't, and the homeowner had an AR-15.
Case number 8, Zachary Peters, Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, March 27, 2017, 12:36 p.m. Zachary Peters was 23 years old, living with his family in a 2-story house in a quiet suburb. He was home alone that afternoon, playing video games in his room, when he heard glass breaking downstairs. Not a window, the back door. Someone had kicked it in. Zachary grabbed his AR-15 rifle, a weapon he'd bought 2 years earlier for sports shooting and home defense, and moved to the top of the stairs. He could hear multiple voices, multiple people. They were wearing masks. They were advancing through the first floor toward the staircase. They thought the house was empty. They were wrong. This is every homeowner's nightmare scenario. Multiple intruders, masks, moving through your house. You're alone. You're outnumbered. You have seconds to decide. Hide, run, fight. Zachary Peters decided to fight. 3 teenagers entered the kitchen. Maxwell Cook, 19 years old. Jacob Redfern, 17. Jacob Redfern, 16. They were dressed in all black, faces covered by ski masks, wearing gloves. They looked like a SWAT team. They looked like they meant business. Zachary Peters opened fire from the top of the stairs. The AR-15 fired in semi-automatic mode, 1 trigger pull, 1 shot, but fast, very fast. The sound in the enclosed space was deafening. The teenagers didn't have time to react, didn't have time to run, didn't have time to surrender. All 3 died in the kitchen, multiple gunshot wounds each. The coroner's report later showed that Zachary had fired 17 rounds in approximately 8 seconds. Not all of them hit, but enough did. When police arrived 3 minutes later, called by neighbors who heard the gunshots, they found Zachary sitting on his front steps in shock, still holding the rifle. Inside, they found 3 bodies, and in the driveway, they found a 4th person, the getaway driver. Elizabeth Rodriguez, 21 years old, had been waiting in the car while her 3 accomplices broke into the house. She'd helped plan the robbery. She'd driven them to the location. She'd been the lookout. But she'd never entered the house, never held a weapon, never fired a shot. Zachary Peters killed 3 people and faced no charges. Elizabeth Rodriguez killed nobody and is serving multiple life sentences. Both were involved in the same incident. How does that make sense? The Broken Arrow District Attorney reviewed the case for 2 weeks. They interviewed Zachary Peters extensively. They examined the scene. They reviewed Oklahoma's castle doctrine laws, and they announced that Zachary Peters had acted in justifiable self-defense. The reasoning was straightforward. 3 masked intruders had violently broken into his home while he was present. He had no way of knowing if they were armed. He had no way of knowing their intent. He had no duty to retreat in his own home. Under Oklahoma law, he had every right to use lethal force. The fact that he used an AR-15, a weapon that anti-gun advocates call an assault rifle and gun rights advocates call a modern sporting rifle, didn't matter legally. The law doesn't specify which weapons you can use for home defense, only that the force used must be proportional to the threat. 3 masked intruders, an AR-15 is proportional. But Elizabeth Rodriguez faced a different legal principle, felony murder. Oklahoma law, like many states, has a rule. If someone dies during the commission of a felony you're participating in, you're responsible for their death, even if you didn't pull the trigger. The logic is that by engaging in the felony, in this case a burglary, you set in motion the chain of events that led to the death. Elizabeth Rodriguez was charged with 3 counts of first-degree felony murder. She was convicted on all counts. She's currently serving multiple life sentences. Let me be clear about what this means. Elizabeth Rodriguez will die in prison for the deaths of 3 people she didn't kill, shot by a homeowner who faced no charges for killing them. This is where the law reveals something uncomfortable about how we calculate responsibility. Zachary Peters made a split-second decision to defend himself with lethal force. Society says, hero. Elizabeth Rodriguez made a decision to participate in a burglary. Society says you're responsible for every consequence, including consequences you couldn't predict and didn't intend. Both perspectives have logic. Zachary Peters had no time to evaluate whether the intruders were armed or dangerous. He saw masks and movement and responded with overwhelming force to eliminate the threat. That's textbook self-defense. Elizabeth Rodriguez participated in a violent felony that resulted in 3 deaths. Even though she didn't pull the trigger, she helped create the circumstances that made those deaths happen. That's textbook felony murder.
but when you put them side by side, the mathematics of justice feels uneven. The families of Maxwell Cook, Jacob Redfern, and Jacob Woodruff held a joint press conference after the DA's announcement. They were devastated. They said their sons had made a terrible mistake, but they didn't deserve to die for it. They said Zachary Peters had every right to defend himself, but 17 rounds? Was that really necessary? The DA responded in a follow-up statement. When 3 masked individuals violently break into your home, you don't have the luxury of measured responses. You don't have time to assess whether they're armed, what their intentions are, or whether they'll hurt you. You react to survive. Zachary Peters did what any reasonable person would do in that situation. He eliminated the threat. Zachary Peters never gave an interview. His family released one statement through their attorney. Zachary is traumatized by what happened. He didn't want anyone to die. He wanted to be safe in his own home. The fact that 3 young people lost their lives is a tragedy, but it's a tragedy they created by breaking into a home with masks and gloves. Zachary will have to live with this forever. Elizabeth Rodriguez's trial became a focal point for criminal justice reform advocates. They argued that felony murder laws disproportionately punish getaway drivers and accomplices, while the actual killers, even when legally justified, face no consequences. They argued that Elizabeth was 21 years old, had no prior felonies, and would spend the rest of her life in prison for a burglary that went wrong. Prosecutors countered. She helped plan it. She drove them there. She was the lookout. Without her, those 3 teenagers wouldn't have been in that house. The fact that a homeowner legally defended himself doesn't absolve her of responsibility for putting them in that situation. 3 teenagers died in Oklahoma, and their accomplice got life in prison. But in Georgia, a different kind of trap was set. One where the intruder was let in by someone the family trusted. And when that trap was sprung, a mother defended herself and walked free. But the real question is, who's really responsible when a friend betrays you?
Case number 9, The Betrayal. Stone Mountain, Georgia, August 26, 2015, 9:47 p.m. The mother's name was Green, identified in court documents only by last name to protect her family's privacy. She was a single mother, working 2 jobs, raising 3 children in a modest house in a neighborhood where people still looked out for each other. One of her son's friends was a young man named Javarian Mitchell. He'd been coming around for about 6 months, friendly, polite. He'd eaten dinner with the family, played video games with her son, once helped fix the family car when it broke down. Green trusted him. That trust would nearly get her killed. On the night of August 26th, Javarian Mitchell knocked on Green's door at 9:47 p.m. She opened it without hesitation. Why wouldn't she? He was her son's friend. He stepped inside, and 30 seconds later, a second man entered. Keandre Funches, 20 years old, with a handgun already drawn. This wasn't a burglary. This was an ambush. Imagine opening your door for someone you trust, someone who's been in your home before, someone your children know, and realizing, too late, that they've set a trap, that you're prey, that the person you trusted has sold you out. Keandre Funches pointed the gun at Green and demanded cash. He knew she worked 2 jobs. Javarian Mitchell had told her she kept cash in the house because she didn't trust banks. He knew exactly what drawer to check. What neither Javarian Mitchell nor Keandre Funches knew was that Green kept something else in that drawer, a .38 revolver. When Keandre advanced toward her, demanding money, Green pulled the gun and fired. 1 shot, center mass. Keandre Funches collapsed. He died at the scene before paramedics arrived. Javarian Mitchell ran. Green called 911. Police arrived to find her shaking, crying, sitting on her couch with the gun on the table and a dead body in her living room. The investigation took 3 days. Detectives interviewed Green's children, who confirmed that Javarian Mitchell had been a frequent visitor. They pulled text messages between Mitchell and Funches, showing they'd been planning the robbery for a week. They found evidence that Mitchell had taken photos of the house layout and sent them to Funches with details about when Green would be home alone. Green was cleared immediately under Georgia's Stand Your Ground law. She'd been ambushed in her own home by an armed intruder. Clear-cut self-defense. She'd done everything right. But Javarian Mitchell faced something called felony murder, the same law that convicted Elizabeth Rodriguez in Oklahoma. Javarian Mitchell never touched a weapon. He never threatened Green. He just opened a door. So why is he serving life without parole while Green walked free? Because Georgia law says if you create a deadly situation and someone dies, you're the murderer, even if someone else pulled the trigger. The logic of felony murder is straightforward. If you participate in a dangerous felony and someone dies as a result, anyone, including your accomplice, you're responsible. It doesn't matter if you intended for someone to die. It doesn't matter if you were surprised by what happened. You created the dangerous situation. You're liable for all consequences. Javarian Mitchell's defense attorneys argued that he hadn't pulled a weapon, hadn't threatened anyone, hadn't known Keandre would actually use the gun. They argued that Mitchell was young, stupid, and made a terrible decision, but didn't deserve life in prison for it. The prosecution presented the text messages, the photos of the house, the planning. They argued that Mitchell had orchestrated the entire robbery. He'd gained Green's trust specifically to learn her routine, her security, when she'd be vulnerable. He weaponized friendship. And when his plan resulted in Keandre Funches' death, he was just as responsible as if he'd pulled the trigger himself. The jury convicted Javarian Mitchell of felony murder. He was sentenced to life without parole. This case asks a question that's been running beneath every story we've told. Where does responsibility actually lie? Green shot Keandre Funches. She pulled the trigger. She ended his life, but she's free because society says she had the right to defend herself. Keandre Funches pointed the gun at Green. He created the immediate threat, but he's dead, so he faces no legal consequences. Javarian Mitchell never touched a weapon. He was in a different room when the shot was fired, but he's in prison for life because his betrayal created the circumstances that led to death. The law says all 3 outcomes are correct, but emotionally, morally, it feels complicated. After the trial, Green gave one interview to a local news station. She said, "I trusted him. My children trusted him. He ate at our table, and he brought a man with a gun into our home. If I hadn't my own gun, I'd be dead. My children would be orphans. So yes, he deserves to be in prison for the rest of his life." She added something that still haunts me. The worst part wasn't the gun, it was the betrayal. I keep thinking about all the times he sat in my living room, played with my kids, smiled at me, and the whole time he was planning this. How do you ever trust anyone again after that? Javarian Mitchell's mother attended every day of the trial. After sentencing, she told reporters, "My son made a horrible mistake, but he's 20 years old. Life without parole? That means he dies in prison. Is that really justice?" The prosecutor replied, "He weaponized trust. He turned friendship into a trap, and when that trap resulted in his accomplice's death, he became responsible. That's not injustice. That's the law holding people accountable for the full consequences of their actions." 9 cases, 9 homeowners. Some went to prison for life. Some walked free. Some killed intruders who were stealing. Others killed people they invited inside.
But there's one case we haven't discussed yet, the one that doesn't fit any category, the one where the homeowners weren't defending anything, they were hunting.
Case number 10, The Penthouse. Ocean City, Maryland, Memorial Day weekend, 2002. From the outside, Benjamin and Erica Sifrit looked like they'd stepped out of a recruitment poster for the American dream. He was 24, a Navy SEAL with the kind of square-jawed confidence that made strangers trust him instantly. She was 23, a former college basketball star with a smile that lit up photographs. They were on vacation, celebrating their second wedding anniversary, staying in a luxury penthouse condo called the Rainbow Condominiums, overlooking the boardwalk. They met Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley on a bus. Joshua was 32 years old, a mortgage broker from Fairfax, Virginia. Martha was 51, recently divorced, looking forward to a relaxing weekend at the beach. They struck up a conversation with the Sifrits. Benjamin told stories about Navy SEALs. Erica talked about basketball. They were charming, friendly, normal. When Benjamin suggested they all continue the party back at their penthouse, Joshua and Martha didn't hesitate. Why would they? He was a Navy SEAL. She was a college athlete. These were people you'd want as neighbors. They walked into the condo at approximately 11:30 p.m. on May 25, 2002. Only 2 of them would walk out alive. There's a detail about the Sifrit case that wasn't released until the trial. It involves a Polaroid camera found in the penthouse and what was photographed. We'll get to that, but first you need to understand who Benjamin and Erica Sifrit really were beneath the uniforms and smiles. Benjamin Sifrit's Navy SEAL career had ended 2 years earlier under circumstances the Navy refused to discuss publicly. Court documents later revealed he'd been discharged for personality disorder unsuitable for military service. Translation, he'd scared his commanding officers. There were reports of him collecting photographs of corpses during training exercises, reports of him talking about killing with the same casual tone someone uses to discuss fishing, reports of behavior that suggested he didn't just tolerate violence, he craved it. Erica Sifrit had been an All-American basketball player at the University of Mary Washington, but her teammates later testified to something darker. She'd been obsessed with knives. She collected them. She talked constantly about wanting to know what it feels like to kill someone. Her self-chosen nickname in college was Death. They'd met at a basketball game. Friends later said it was like watching 2 predators recognize each other. And on Memorial Day weekend 2002, Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley walked into their trap. This isn't a case about home defense. There was no burglary, no break-in, no threat. Joshua and Martha were invited guests who thought they were safe. This is about something else entirely, something that has nothing to do with protection and everything to do with predation. Sometime around midnight, Benjamin Sifrit accused Joshua Ford of stealing Erica's purse. It was a lie. The purse was in the bedroom in plain view. But it created chaos, panic. Joshua and Martha tried to leave. The Sifrits blocked the door. They tried to hide in the bathroom. Benjamin Sifrit kicked the door open. What happened next is documented in autopsy reports and crime scene photographs, so brutal that even the judge restricted their release from public records. Both victims were murdered, then dismembered with a knife and handsaw that Benjamin had brought to the condo. This wasn't spontaneous. The tools were there, ready, waiting. The Sifrits put the body parts in garbage bags. They drove to a dumpster behind a grocery store and disposed of the remains. Then they went back to the penthouse, cleaned the bathroom, and went to bed. The next morning, they went shopping. Surveillance footage from a jewelry store shows Erica Sifrit trying on necklaces while wearing Martha Crutchley's rings and earrings. She's smiling, laughing with the clerk, making small talk about the weather. She's wearing the jewelry of a woman she'd murdered 12 hours earlier.
The Sifrits were caught 4 days later, not for murder, for breaking into a Hooters restaurant, and that's when the perfect couple's vacation became a crime scene. On May 29th, 4 days after the murders, Benjamin and Erica Sifrit were arrested for breaking into a Hooters restaurant in Ocean City. It was a petty burglary. They'd stolen money from a cash register. When police searched Erica's purse, they found Martha Crutchley's driver's license and credit cards. Police immediately connected it to a missing persons report filed by Martha's family. They searched the penthouse. They found traces of blood that had survived the cleaning. Luminol detected blood spatter on the bathroom walls, floor, ceiling. They found hacksaw blades with human tissue still attached. They found garbage bags that matched the ones divers later recovered from the bay, containing human remains. And they found the Polaroid camera. Inside were photos of Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley, alive, in the penthouse, smiling, holding drinks, having fun. And in the final photo, Benjamin Sifrit posing with a knife, standing behind Joshua, grinning at the camera like someone taking a trophy photo after a successful hunt. They documented it like it was a game. This is the nightmare that lives beneath every warning about stranger danger. Joshua and Martha did everything right. They met the Sifrits in public. They kept conversation light. Nothing about Benjamin and Erica suggested danger. He was a SEAL. She was an athlete. These were people you'd trust, and they were hunting. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: the blood, the tools, the remains, the Polaroids. Benjamin Sifrit's journal found in the penthouse with the final entry written the morning after the murders. We finally did it, and it was everything we thought it would be. The defense tried to argue that Joshua and Martha had become aggressive, that the Sifrits had feared for their lives, but the Polaroids destroyed that narrative. You don't pose for trophy photos if you're defending yourself. Benjamin Sifrit was convicted of 2 counts of second-degree murder. He's currently serving 38 years in a Maryland state prison. He'll be eligible for release in 2040 when he's 62 years old. Erica Sifrit was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder. The jury found that she'd been the instigator, the one who'd suggested inviting the couple back, the one who'd wanted to know what it feels like. She's serving life without parole plus 20 years. At sentencing, Martha Crutchley's daughter read a victim impact statement. She said her mother had been excited for the beach trip. She'd called the night before she died and said she'd met a nice couple and was going to their penthouse for drinks. That was the last time they spoke. She looked directly at Erica Sifrit and said, "You wore my mother's jewelry while she was in pieces in a dumpster. You smiled at salespeople while wearing her rings. What kind of monster are you?" Erica Sifrit showed no emotion. Joshua Ford's brother also testified. He said Joshua had been his best friend, that Joshua had trusted people too easily, had always believed the best in strangers. He said that trust had killed him. He looked at Benjamin Sifrit and said, "You were a Navy SEAL. People are supposed to be able to trust you, and you used that trust to hunt human beings." The Sifrit case doesn't fit the pattern of any other story we've told, because there was no self-defense claim, no burglar, no intruder, no threat, just 2 predators who found prey. But I included it for a reason, because it's the clearest example of what happens when the line between protection and predation doesn't just blur, it disappears entirely. Byron Smith crossed the line when he whispered, "You're dying." The Sifrits never recognized the line existed.
10 cases, 10 homeowners, 5 in prison, 3 acquitted, 2 with reduced sentences or no charges. What's the difference? Let me show you the pattern that prosecutors and juries look for. These are the red flags that transform self-defense into murder. Byron Smith brought water, snacks, and a tape recorder to his basement. Markus Kaarma installed baby monitors and left his garage open with bait visible. Benjamin and Erica Sifrit brought tools for dismemberment. These aren't the actions of people defending themselves. These are the actions of people planning. Compare this to Zachary Peters, who grabbed a rifle when masked intruders broke down his door, or Benjamin Batterham, who woke to an intruder near his baby's room, or Green, who pulled a gun from a drawer when ambushed. The law recognizes panic. It doesn't recognize patience. Jerome Ersland's first shot was legal. His sixth shot was murder. The threat ended when Antoine Parker hit the floor unconscious. Thomas Greer's shots in his hallway might have been justified, but chasing Andrea Miller into an alley after she was fleeing, that's pursuit, not protection. Tony Martin's shots at intruders in his home could be argued as fear-driven, but shooting Fred Barris in the back as he climbed out a window, that's execution. Markus Kaarma told his hairdresser he was going to shoot some kids before it happened. Byron Smith told neighbors he was tired of being a victim and wouldn't let it happen again. The Sifrits journal entry said, "We finally did it." These statements, made before or after the incidents, reveal that part of them wanted confrontation. They weren't just defending, they were waiting for an opportunity. Byron Smith's whisper, "You're dying," before the shot under Hailey Kafer's chin, that's not fear, that's cruelty. Jerome Ersland stepping over an unconscious teenager, retrieving a second gun and firing 5 more shots, that's not defense, that's revenge. The Sifrits dismembering bodies and posing for photos, that's not protection, that's hunting. But here's what keeps me awake. All of these red flags can exist simultaneously with genuine fear. Byron Smith had been burglarized 3 times. Markus Kaarma had lost irreplaceable items. Jerome Ersland was facing armed robbers. Tony Martin had been violated repeatedly. Their fear was real. Their anger was justified. Their desire to feel safe was understandable. And yet, they're in prison. The cases where homeowners walked free, Joe Horn, Thomas Greer, Benjamin Batterham, Zachary Peters, and Green, shared different characteristics. Joe Horn called 911 the moment he saw the burglary. Zachary Peters grabbed his rifle when the door was kicked in. Green pulled her gun when ambushed. These are reactions, not plans. Zachary Peters faced 3 masked intruders who'd violently broken in. An AR-15 is proportional to that threat. Benjamin Batterham faced a meth addict intruder near his baby's room. A chokehold, while tragic, was proportional to his fear. Thomas Greer was 80 years old with a broken collarbone. Joe Horn lived in Texas, where property protection laws are very broad. Green was a single mother ambushed by someone she trusted. Juries don't just evaluate actions, they evaluate people, and they're more sympathetic to an 80-year-old bleeding victim than a healthy 64-year-old who prepared for 18 hours. Benjamin Batterham's case hinged on medical testimony that the chokehold alone wouldn't have killed a healthy person. It was the meth and heart condition. Thomas Greer's case couldn't definitively prove he wasn't still in fear for his life, given his age and injuries. These ambiguities create reasonable doubt, and reasonable doubt means acquittal. If you've stayed with me for this entire journey, through basements and garages, pharmacies and penthouses, chokeholds and AR-15s, it's because part of you understands that any of us could be Byron Smith or Joe Horn or Benjamin Batterham, not because we're violent, but because we're afraid. And fear is the most dangerous variable in home defense. Fear transforms into adrenaline, adrenaline transforms into action, and action transforms into consequences.
I started by asking, when does a protector become a predator? After examining 10 cases, interviewing jurors, consulting prosecutors, reading thousands of pages of testimony, I have an answer. You become a predator the moment you stop reacting and start deciding. That moment can last 7 seconds, or 60 seconds, or 18 hours. But somewhere in that span, there's a moment where your brain shifts from survival mode to calculation mode. From, I need to stop this threat, to, I want to punish this person. For Jerome Ersland, that moment was walking to the back room to retrieve a second gun. For Byron Smith, it was sitting in his basement for 18 hours with water and snacks, waiting. For Markus Kaarma, it was leaving his garage door open with bait visible while he watched on a baby monitor. For the Sifrits, there was no moment. They were always predators. But for Zachary Peters, Benjamin Batterham, Joe Horn, Thomas Greer, and Green, that moment never came. They reacted. They feared, they survived, and the law protected them because juries believed their fear was genuine and proportional. Here's what I want you to take from this. If you own a gun, a bat, a knife, anything you might use to defend your home, you need to understand something that nobody tells you at the gun range or in concealed carry classes. The law doesn't care about your fear, it cares about your actions. You can be genuinely terrified and still go to prison for murder if your actions cross the line. You can be legitimately defending yourself and still be convicted if you fire one shot too many, chase one step too far, wait 1 second too long to call 911. So, where is the line? The line is this. The moment the threat can no longer hurt you, you must stop. When the intruder is unconscious, stop. When the intruder is fleeing, stop. When you have time to retrieve a second weapon, you have time to call 911 instead. When you're sitting in your basement with snacks, waiting for someone to break in, you've already crossed the line. The law allows you to defend yourself. It doesn't allow you to punish. It doesn't allow you to insure. It doesn't allow you to teach them a lesson. It allows you to stop the immediate threat, nothing more. The cases that haunt me. Byron Smith would be free if he'd stopped at the first shot, or even the second, but he whispered, "You're dying," and destroyed any claim of self-defense. Jerome Ersland would be free if he'd called 911 after the first shot, but he retrieved a second gun and executed an unconscious teenager. Markus Kaarma would be free if he'd just installed an alarm system instead of creating a trap, but he baited teenagers and shot blindly through walls. Tony Martin might have been acquitted if he'd fired warning shots or shot to wound instead of shooting a fleeing teenager in the back, but he aimed to kill. All of them were victims first. All of them became murderers by waiting too long, shooting too many times, or planning too carefully. The cases that vindicate the law. Zachary Peters faced 3 masked intruders and eliminated the threat. No execution shots, no chasing, no planning, just reaction. Benjamin Batterham chased an intruder to protect his baby, and the death resulted from a tragic combination of factors, not sadism. Joe Horn called 911 and stayed on the phone. His decision to go outside was questionable, but he lived in a state where property protection is paramount. Tony Martin was 80 years old and beaten. His pursuit might have been excessive, but prosecutors couldn't prove he was thinking clearly enough to recognize the threat had ended. Green was ambushed by someone she trusted. Her response was immediate and proportional. All of them can claim they reacted rather than planned, and that made the difference. I want to end with something one of the jurors from Byron Smith's trial told me. She said, the hardest part was knowing that if he just stopped, if he just fired the first shot and called 911, those teenagers would still be in prison for burglary, and Byron would be home with his family. Instead, 2 kids are dead, and a 64-year-old will die in prison, all because of 7 seconds.
7 seconds where he stopped being afraid and started being angry. That's the line. Fear is legal. Anger is murder. And if you ever find yourself in that moment, in that split second where fear transforms into rage, where defense transforms into revenge, remember that juries can hear the difference, prosecutors can prove the difference, and the law will punish the difference. You have the right to protect yourself. You have the right to defend your home. You have the right to use force to stop an immediate threat. But the moment you cross from protection to punishment, you've committed murder. And no amount of fear, no amount of prior victimization, no amount of justifiable anger will save you. 10 homeowners, 10 cases, 5 in prison for life, 3 walking free, 2 in the gray area between. The difference wasn't always what they did. Sometimes it was when they did it, how many times, what they said, how old they were, where they lived. Justice isn't always consistent, but the line exists, and if you ever have to defend your home, you need to know where it is, because you won't know you've crossed it until it's too late.